Recently, our board met and we had an agenda. We had things that we needed to talk about. But after the agenda, we just kind of sat around and wasted time together. We found ourselves talking about the church, found ourselves talking about where we were sensing that God was leading us and what God was saying to us. And I don't know about the other guys in the meeting that day, but I really sensed that God was speaking to us and speaking through us in that meeting after the meeting. We got through our agenda, and then we had a conversation without an agenda. That was the heart of the assignment that I gave you earlier this week, a conversation with God without agenda. When was the last time you just wasted time with the Father? No agenda, no requests, no prayer needs, just spending time with God. I'm increasingly trying to do this, and I'll confess I'm terrible at it. I typically come to God when I need something, and I seem to always need something. Or when something comes alive to me in Scripture, when God speaks to me, I find I instantly want to start turning it into a sermon or a message, Devo. I'm looking for how to apply it in this ministry or in that project. And I don't know, maybe that's just me. But at the heart of everything the Scriptures teach us about God rests a very clear picture of a God who desires that we would grow in intimacy with Him, that we would love wasting time with Him. More than anything else, the Spirit of the living God longs that we might experience not displays of power, not special gifts, but true intimacy with Him. The whole of the Bible is relentlessly driven by this objective. This is not a game with God. He's not trying to trip us up or be cruel. What if everything that God does is designed to draw us into intimacy? Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear that, the question that comes to my mind is this: so why does it seem so hard? I just want to know when God has something to say to me and what it is that He's saying. I want to hear God clearly speak. Why does it seem so hard? In fact, I can't count the amount of times I've heard people say, Christians say, I've never heard God speak. And not just young people either, people who have been believers for years. I've never heard God speak to me. In almost every case where the person was a believer, it's not that they hadn't heard God, but that they had their mind made up as to what hearing God should look or sound like. And because they hadn't had an experience like that, they assumed they hadn't heard God speak. So I want to return to a passage we touched on earlier in the series, John chapter 10, verses 1 through 15. I'm going to read sections of it, but I would encourage you to pause the video, grab a Bible, and follow along. Make sure I am not making this up. John chapter 10, starting at verse 1. Truly, truly, or the old King James would say, verily, verily. Some of the new translations have Jesus saying, I tell you the truth. Basically, Jesus is saying, pay attention, boys. I got something I want you to hear, as He's talking to His disciples. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him, to the shepherd, the gatekeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own, his sheep by name, and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, because they don't know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with His disciples, but they did not understand what He was saying. So Jesus again said to them. So Jesus backs up. He starts over and He expands on it a bit to try to help His disciples understand. Then Jesus says this in verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay my life down or the sheep. Then later in verse 27, Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Accept that as truth, even if you don't feel it. Accept it as the starting point, these words of Jesus. Accept it as the foundation. Accept it by faith. Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. Now, right where you're sitting, I'm going to invite you to say, I hear his voice. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, come on, I hear his voice. Jesus said, my sheep know my voice. Say, I know his voice. Come on, don't be bashful. I know his voice. Jesus said, my sheep follow. Say, I follow the shepherd. I follow the shepherd. Let's start with here. There's nothing spooky about this word. There's nothing hyper spiritual here. The word hear means what it says. His sheep can physically hear. They perceive his voice. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that for years I approached the task, if I could put it that way, of hearing God as if God were hiding or at least hidden. I'd become convinced that God only spoke in riddles or code, obscuring what it is that he wanted me to do and then getting mad when I didn't do it. I read stories of people in the Bible who heard God. I grew up in a church where people talked a lot about hearing God. I read passages like John 10, but it always seemed like such a struggle to know what God might be saying to me. Thing is, Jesus isn't even making a promise here. He's stating it as fact. Jesus doesn't say, my sheep will eventually hear my voice when they jump through certain hoops or reach a certain age. Jesus doesn't say, my sheep can hear my voice, that they're able to. No promises, but at least they have the ability. It's not what he's saying. Jesus says that if we are his, we are not just capable of hearing the shepherd's voice. According to Jesus, we actually hear his voice. Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. Fact. And yes, it's more than just reading the Bible. Lots of people read the Bible and don't hear God's voice. So have you ever had this experience? Have you ever spent a season memorizing a chunk of scripture? Maybe you memorized a psalm or a chapter in the Bible, or where you recited it every day, or maybe you memorized one of the smaller books of the Bible, say James or the book of Ruth or the Gospel of Mark. If you've never done it, this might not make sense what I'm about to say here, but I would strongly encourage you to try it. And you'll notice, if you do that, and if you've done it, you will probably have noticed this, how the passage seemed to fit so perfectly whatever it is that you were going through or dealing with at that moment in your life. It's like God had led you to that book, that passage, that chapter, for that exact moment in your life. It just seems so relevant. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience, and if you've memorized a chunk of scripture and meditated and reflected on it over a season, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so it's not that God led you to that passage. Now, he may have in some instances, but it's more likely that in memorizing that passage and meditating on that passage, you've given God something to work with. God is so deeply and completely embedded in every book of the Bible that any book, passage, or scripture that you study, that you dig into, that you memorize and reflect on, God can use and will use to speak to your current circumstances. It'll be a perfect fit to whatever it is that you are going through. When you memorize and meditate on scripture, you're giving God open access to your heart, to your mind, to your situation, to your day, and he will use it. Maybe all you can manage is a verse or a line or the outline of a story in Mark's gospel or 5 words of scripture that you can memorize. Read it, memorize it, meditate on it over a period of time. And I promise you, God will use it to speak to you, and that whatever he says will be powerfully relevant to what it is that you are going through in your life at that moment. This is how we learn to hear the Father's voice. But God's desire is that our hearing would move beyond just hearing and move to knowing him, would move to intimacy. Think about it. What if in those moments when it seems hard to hear God speak, when it seems like he is whispering, what if God does that as a means of nudging us to lean in closer, closer, so that we are drawn into intimacy? That is, so hearing moves to knowing. In the second message of this series, we looked at 3 different types of knowing, so I'm not going to go over that again. The messages are available online and you can listen to them. But know this, Jesus invites us as his sheep to move from just hearing his voice and just recognizing his voice to knowing him. That's pretty clear in John chapter 10. You get to verses 14 and 15. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. How do we know him? Just as a father knows me and I know the Father. That knowing between Jesus and the Father and the Son, that is an intimate level of knowing. And Jesus says, I know my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. Wow. But it doesn't stop there. So for a long time, I thought of hearing the shepherd, of hearing Jesus, of hearing God's voice as the relationship, as the whole point. I wanted to hear and recognize his voice because I thought that's what it meant to be a Christian. But with this picture of sheep and the shepherd, it's pretty clear that hearing the shepherd is not enough. Knowing that it is the shepherd that is calling is not enough. He invites us to follow. Now, can I be totally honest here? I'm not sure in my flesh, in myself, that I want to be with Jesus constantly. Does that sound bad? I mean, all the time? I'm not sure if I want the life of Christ alive in me. What I want the power of Christ, especially when I need power, right? I want the wisdom of Christ, especially when I need wisdom. I want the knowledge of Christ when I need knowledge. I want the gifts of Christ. But to have the life of Christ overwhelm me, dominate or drown out my life, to smother me, to put my flesh to death? It's one thing to hear his invitations, another to recognize that it's his voice that I'm hearing. But to follow Jesus, to follow the shepherd, to risk it all, to give up everything that I have worked for and achieved, everything that I am. I'm the rich young ruler that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. I know why he walked away. See, to follow Jesus means there are certain movies I cannot watch, do not watch, because I follow. There are certain books I do not read, certain places I do not go, certain habits and behaviors that I must reject. And it is not always that these things are bad or wrong. Sometimes things that other Christians are permitted to do, I cannot do not do, must not do, because my shepherd calls me to follow him. We're going to talk about what it means to hear the Father in the context of community next. But Jesus doesn't call me to follow the butt of another sheep. He calls me to follow him. I know it's not supposed to be, but sometimes the journey towards intimacy with God can become discouraging. I know what I want. But like the Apostle Paul in Romans 7, I don't understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want to do. I end up doing what I don't want to do. But hear this, there is no shame in struggling. Jesus doesn't offer condemnation when we struggle. He offers forgiveness. I'll say that again. Jesus doesn't offer condemnation when we struggle. He offers forgiveness. Don't forget that the one who said, my sheep hear, my sheep know my voice, my sheep follow, is also the one who tells the story of a good shepherd who searches to find a single lost lamb. the lamb that didn't follow and ended up lost and alone and in danger. And Jesus ends that parable this way to make sure we get the point in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 18. He says, in the same way, it is not the Father's will that any should perish. I'm not sure where you are in your journey, but know this: the Good Shepherd loves you. Just as you are, he loves you. Exactly as you are. You don't need to do anything, change anything, alter anything to make him love you. He loves you. Forget for a moment what others have said. Listen instead to the voice of your shepherd. He loves you.